Hello, it's Dr. Kowalczyk here. I apologize profusely for my absence. I had promised you a bunch of videos right at the end of my last video, and that week um, I had several family tragedies and occurrences that happened. My mother-in-law had a massive heart attack, and then shortly after that, my daughter also ended up going into the hospital for a prolonged period of time. And I had to travel to be with them and to help take care of them and set everything up. And I know that's a terrible excuse, but I did have family emergencies that have put us now about 2 to 3 weeks behind. And I apologize. I'm gonna do everything I can to get us caught up and also not overwhelm you. Remember, the goal of this course is simply to provide some historical information to help us understand the modern world. And I'm hoping that we can continue to do that. I am going to have some assignments due coming up here that will help get us caught up in many ways. And again, I don't want to overburden you or load on you. I know you have other courses that you're going to be doing, and these are all things that I was planning on doing anyway. And I'll give you plenty of time to complete these assignments and give you plenty of warning, and they won't be terribly difficult anyway. And so again, I apologize for my absence and lack of communication as well. It's just that being away from campus and not keeping up with my Millikin portal very much, I apologize. But I'll do everything I can to help get you caught up. Regardless, welcome back, and hopefully you get something out of these pithy videos that I've been giving you. I want to start by beginning or by reiterating and recapping where we were. So Rome has vanished and has descended into in the West has descended into a period where various tribes on the outskirts of Rome have invaded Rome, have sacked Rome, and different tribes have come in and basically helped the previous western half of the Roman Empire disintegrate. It's a period of the barbarian invasions. And this happened roughly from the 300s into the 600s and 700s. And the western half of the old Roman Empire is really Rome doesn't exist anymore at that particular period of time. It is a collection of odd tribes and entities, and it is only going to be with the emergence of a very strong leader in the year 800 that we see the restoration of any sense of the old Roman Empire and the beginnings of what is today called Europe. And so you could essentially boil down Western Europe or Europe at that particular period of time, the 500s and 600s CE. It's chaotic. It's pure chaos. Now that doesn't mean that it's dark. I loathe the term Dark Ages. It just means that it's a period of transition and a period of development, and many of the things that become Western civilization are born in this period of time, or they appear in this time. It's just that they're not cultivated and they don't come under a strong political entity. It is one leader after another, one tribe after another, one war after another in the West. But that begs the question, what is going on in the eastern half of the Roman Empire? If you remember when I talked about Constantine, he split the Roman Empire in half. If you go to the first map that I included in your lecture outline, which is on the second page, you see a distinction between the western half of the empire and the eastern half of the empire. The eastern half of the empire becomes known as the Byzantine Empire. I've mentioned this before, and I said that I was going to talk about it, and now is the time. The Byzantine Empire, first of all, it's called Byzantine after Byzantium, which is the actual city that Constantine chose to set up his new capital, and eventually it becomes known as Constantinople. And then when it is eventually conquered in the 1500s or 1400s, even earlier, 1300s, it becomes known as Istanbul. That ancient city is one of the linchpins and keys to all of history. It is a shame that in our modern history, in our teaching of modern history, and also because of events in Europe, and because of the eventual domination of the Western world, speak in this case specifically speaking of the United States, that Constantine or Constantinople is kind of a forgotten city. It was the ancient jewel. It was the center of the world. Constantine, when he moved his administrative state to the center of the Roman Empire, did not realize he was actually splitting the empire in half. Um, but geographically, it's like it's the perfect place of east meets west. Immediately to the west of Constantinople are the our mountain is a mountain range, and the Balkan Mountains. and it is very hard to travel. And that's one of the reasons that the empire splits is because of the difficulty in communication. But Constantine was an administrative genius, and he was able to hold it together because of the people he put in place and because of the administrative state he put into place. But for all intents and purposes, again, because of the barbarian invasions in the West, the the focus of the new Roman emperors was on the East, and this is kind of forgotten. A lot of Westerners, especially those descended from European influence, tend to focus on what happened in Rome. And the reason we call it the Dark Ages is because of the barbaric invasions. Uh, the reason that so much emphasis and focus is put on France and Germany, etc., is because that's the legacy of so many people from the 1800s, from the 1700s. But the truth is, the center of the world in most world occurrences from the 300s all the way into the 1400s and 1500s until the Renaissance in the West, the dominance of culture and influence in the world was coming from the Byzantine Empire or the eastern half of the Roman Empire. That's where real things happened. The Byzantine Empire was far richer, it was superior in numbers, its system of government was much more efficient. The Roman emperors, which continued, you could make the argument all the way until the disappearance of the Byzantine Empire, um, um, were, I mean, Rome never really disappeared in that sense. It changed name because of location and because the what was once the Roman Empire as a whole disappeared and split. But the legacy of Rome continued on into the Byzantine Empire. And when Byzantium or Constantinople loses control over the West, it puts all of its energy and focus on the remaining part of the Roman Empire, and that becomes the Byzantine Empire. So, if you're looking for a definition, the Byzantine Empire is the Roman Empire eastern half, and it is a political and cultural kingdom mixed with various peoples and tribes, which I'm going to talk more about in a second, and a collection of people groups, an economic entity that exists from uh, what was ancient Greece all the way down through the Middle East, and then eventually spreads all the way into beyond the Black Sea, all the way down to the Red Sea, and then all the way in through northern Africa. And you can kind of see that geographical representation on the map. It spreads even further than what's represented on that map, and you can kind of see that in the second map that I gave you as well. So, in other words, the geographical, political, cultural kingdom that exists from the 300s all the way until the 1400s. And some have argued that it exists all the way until even though it converts to Islam, that its political and its cultural entity remains and continues all the way into the 20th century. Highly debatable, but nevertheless, the Byzantine Empire is an important key and linchpin into the modern world for various reasons, which is what I want to talk about today. So there you have it. It's an empire that exists in the eastern half of the old Roman Empire. It is divorced from the West and its cultural development. You could make the argument that this split between East and West Rome is one of the greatest legacies of the ancient world or of the medieval world that impacts our world today. Just think about many headlines today and in the last 20, 25 years. It is Islam versus Christianity, or it's East meets West, or it is the Middle East and um, Islamic jihadism or Islamic extremism versus Christian extremism. These discussions have been going on for hundreds of years. That discussion of East meets West or East versus West goes all the way back to this particular period of time where the eastern half of the empire is divorced from the western half of the empire, and the eastern half develops entirely differently. Again, because we happen to live and have developed from the West, our tendency tends to be on what happened with the West in the western half of the Roman Empire or what becomes Europe. But we cannot neglect in the history of the world how important the Byzantine Empire is. And today I'm just going to give you a very superficial overview of some of the things that happened. Well, first of all, to get some more context here, if it is the eastern half of the empire, um, I also want us to understand what was in that eastern half. In the eastern half of the empire is a geographical collection of kingdoms and tribes. And I mentioned that before. The Byzantine Empire was Roman in structure, not necessarily in terms of culture. It is not an ethnic group. Remember, it's the Roman idea versus the actual Roman people. The Roman people are still in the West. They've been conquered by these barbarians, these outsiders. The ethnic group Romans, by the way, the term of ethnic groups, I think that's much more of a modern understanding. There is no racism at this particular period of time in terms of how we understand it. There definitely were races and tribes and people groups, but they just didn't view life that way. They didn't view things that way. And so the idea of the Romans were a people group from what is today central Italy, um, but really, it was more so a collection of how to govern and an idea of an empire, an idea of peace, an idea of a system where people could live as citizens or people could live as slaves. It was the feudal system, which I talked about last time. In terms of the Byzantine Empire, it was also the feudal system, and in many ways, it was the most efficient feudal system in all of history. It was incredibly productive, um, and efficient. The rulers of the Byzantine Empire, who were also called Caesars or Kaisers, eventually in German, Czars in Russian. They were the emperors that ruled over a collection of tribes and people groups. This included Arabs. This included Berbers in northern Africa. It included Egyptians, and in some cases Ethiopians. It included various tribes and nomadic groups of Persians, the ancient Persian Empire peoples, which is today Iran, um, Kurds, Armenians, some tribes that still exist to this day that are ancient tribes. The Armenians had converted to Christianity in the fourth century, and they did so even before the Roman emperor. So they were a Christian tribe that what exists in today Turkey, or in the mountains just outside of Turkey and Iraq. There were. This is just scratching the surface. There were multiple tribes and groups that existed throughout the Byzantine Empire, and they all had different influences. They had different cultures. They had different traditions. But under the Byzantine rule, they all maintained somewhat of a peaceable existence. Now, I say somewhat because some of these tribes were very were warlike minded or were conquering. Um, but at the same time, one of the greatest principles and most important parts of the Byzantine Empire is the fact it was um, that it was highly efficient in terms of trade. And many of these tribes stopped conquering or stopped, taking over other tribes because it would disrupt trade. The Byzantine Empire was efficient, and it comes from the fact that in this region, in this part of the world, it is the end of the famous Silk Road. The Silk Road is a trade route that goes all the way from ancient China, all the way up north through eventually to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, north of India, what is today India, north through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then all the way down into what is today the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Israel, etc. This ancient trade route was productive for millennia, if you will, and it was productive at this period of time. And the Byzantine Empire maintained a lock on that trade, and it would go all the way to the Mediterranean, and it was profitable for political rulers, profitable for kingdom. And what the Byzantine Empire did was is it kept the old Roman peace. It kept that together. Now, taxation was fairly light and limited, but it did exist, and it went to Constantinople in the form of payment. Um, and typically, it was a very productive period in terms of trade. Now, also in terms of trade, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, most people don't realize this. It's called the Fertile Crescent for a reason. That is because it was incredible fertile farmland. And this is the feudal system. People worked the land in trade for protection. And the Byzantine rulers and empire were very good at that. And so I don't want to say it was peaceable across the board. It wasn't, because there were tribes and disputes, and you're going to find out some of those with the emergence of Islam. There are all kinds of wars, but at the same time, the Byzantine Empire was able to keep the efficient Roman idea alive for a long period of time, for centuries. And the Byzantine Empire was constantly at war. It kept its legions just like the Romans kept its legions. And it developed into, eventually modernized and did new techniques and all kinds of things. And it adopted the tactics of some of these tribes. And it becomes it has a very Eastern flavor to it, not a very Western flavor at all. But in all of that conflict, it was able to keep together that political, geographical unity of all these tribes and kingdoms. And for the most part, many of these kingdoms and many of these peoples and many of these tribes obeyed the Byzantine rules and laws and were part of this empire because of its efficiency, because it did keep the peace and because it allowed trade to occur and happen and people became wealthy. These tribes became wealthy and existed under the banner of all of this. The other thing that is very important is that the Byzantine Empire had a very distinct religious tradition that is still exists to this day, and it was also a great unifier in this period of time. Many of the tribes and peoples that existed under Byzantine Empire adopted what became known as Eastern Orthodox. Now, Christianity was all one. It is not until late that you see a real split between what becomes known as Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodox, obviously, in the East. Um, they disputed this all the way until the Crusades. They disputed it all the way until after the Crusades as who was the real leader of Christianity. Um, because of the chaos of the West, many Eastern Christians also were disconnected from their brothers in the West. And it became a real argument over who was control. Was it the leader in Rome? Was it the Christian leader in Rome, who eventually becomes known as Pope, the Pope? Or was it the patriarch, or in other words, the ultimate archbishop of Constantinople? He was with the emperor, he's under the emperor's rule, he's in the capital city. And many Christians argued, especially in the Byzantine Empire, that the real leader of Christianity is in the city of Constantinople. And over time, because the empire is split and because there's lack of communication, a different type of Christianity emerged called Eastern Orthodox. It's a distinctly different than Roman Catholicism. It has subtle differences in theology. Some might say drastic differences in theology, but keep in mind it's still a Christian religion, and it's still a Christian. It practices Christianity. It believes in the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, believes that Jesus is divine, believes in the Trinity. It has all the markings of a major Christian religion. Very foreign to many people, though. But you can find examples of it all throughout the United States and around the world. But it is different than how Christianity developed in the West. But the distinct religious tradition of the Eastern Orthodox religion under in the Byzantine Empire is another unifier. It spreads rapidly. Christianity was dominant for centuries in what is today Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. It spreads all the way to the steppes of India. It goes south into Ethiopia. Most people don't realize that Ethiopia has a strong Christian tradition, an ancient tradition. It's alive and well. Christianity is alive and well in Egypt with what is known as Coptic Christianity. That's not Eastern Orthodox, but it's still a Christian tradition. It spreads throughout northern Africa. It is not until its conflict with Islam in the 700s and 800s that this begins to change. And then, even more so, most people don't realize this, that even after Islam conquers politically, there are still very many Christian tribes and practices throughout the Islamic empires. They coexisted. And my point is that the Byzantine Empire, one of the reasons it united so well is because it gave the people a common religion. Same thing Islam does when it comes into power, is that it replaces in many places Eastern Orthodox, but either one are great unifiers. They hold people together, they hold tribes together, and they form a common bond. It's a cultural thing. It identifies them as one in many ways. And that was first in the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Orthodox, in Eastern Orthodoxy as a religious tradition. Not the least of which is Eastern Orthodox as a religion has a huge influence on how cities are built, usually around great cathedrals or around centers of worship. And also, I'm going to talk about in a second, these places become great centers of learning. It is in seminaries in training for priests, or in places of religious monasteries where monks come together to study. They're studying they're studying the Bible and they're studying theology, but they're also practicing incredible amounts of just pure learning. And they collect manuscripts to do so. And so many of the great schools of the East are born out of Eastern Orthodox. So my point is that the Byzantine Empire is all of these things. It's that political unity, it's that religious unity, it's that geographical unity. It's held together. And keep in mind, this goes on for well over 1,000 years. Um, should again, most of us are not familiar with this at all, but it is one of the great pieces, one of the great forgotten pieces of history. So, with that said, what is the forgotten legacy of the Byzantine Empire? Well, I'm going to focus on a few elements here um, to kind of to help us understand why this is so important and why I keep stressing this over and over again. Well, first of all, the Byzantine Empire, and just geographically, if you look at that map, it's got Greece within the Byzantine Empire, but more importantly, um, the eastern half of the Roman Empire was the center of what is called the Hellenistic world. The Hellenistic world is the ancient legacy of Greece, the ancient culture of Greece. And Greek, remember I said in my, first lecture, the Greek influence was enormous. The idea of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, the sciences, in terms of its actual academic legacy, it was passed on into these areas. The cities of the Byzantine Empire. So we're talking about places like Jerusalem, but we're also, talking about places like Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which becomes very important later on. But also many other cities, places of dwelling throughout the Middle East, um, basically um, become centers of great learning in terms of the ancient Greeks. They collected the manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato and all the great Greek thinkers and mathematicians and astronomers, etc., and they studied them. And that, no matter who was in charge for centuries, that's what the people groups studied. Well, the Byzantine Empire conquers those areas, or the Romans conquered those areas, and the Byzantine Empire takes administrative control, and they are overseeing and cultivating the Hellenistic or Greek culture that existed. So what came from the ancient Greeks hundreds, if not thousands of years before, all right, was continued under the Byzantine Empire. Now, whereas in the West there's chaos, and eventually they adopt Aristotle and Plato. Those manuscripts were in disarray, and the learning was in disarray. You could make the case that they didn't catch up in terms of scholarship and academia until the Renaissance. That's what the Renaissance was all about in many ways. But nevertheless, okay, it was in the Byzantine Empire that the real legacy of Greece is carried on. That's true in terms of architecture. That's true in terms of mathematics. That's true in terms of science and astronomy and discovery. And many inventions came out of that particular period of time. And by the way, we're going to talk about this, but Islam just simply adopted many of those practices, and many of the leading cultural influences of the Byzantine Empire. They just become Islamic, and Islam doesn't wipe those out or make them disappear. They simply change religions, and they continue on with those practices. So, in other words, again, it's the legacy of the Greeks. The Byzantine legacy is the legacy of the Greeks. They just keep and they improve upon it. Don't get me wrong. It's not just like they're just curators alone. They also study these things and then they eventually add to it. And if you were going to do like a deep dive study on just the Byzantine Empire, you could start naming names of people who had major influences. Much of algebra was invented in this period of time and then is adopted by Islamic scholars, and it becomes a uh, uh, full mathematical. I mean, we study to this day. It becomes its own entity, its own subject we're studying and applying across the board. So that's incredibly influential. The second, and I mentioned this before, in terms of its legacy, is the curating and protection of trade. Um, in some ways, you can make the argument that this is still the case to this day, even despite the chaos that exists today. Um, that's because of the discovery of oil. Oil is incredibly important in this region. It is the lifeblood of all of these nations that exist in the Middle East, and it's what keeps things moving. Much of the agreements that have been made recently in terms of geopolitics have to do with oil. Uh, the Islamic countries that exist, they form their own strong political entity in the world through the use of oil. Now, that's today. At that time, okay, again, it is trade with the Far East, and it is the production of food that exists under the Byzantine Empire. That Fertile Crescent was the breadbasket of the region, of the area. And it produced and protected trade routes and trade lines. Um, and you could make the case that much of what happens economically in this time, or at much of what in terms of what happens politically and militarily in this particular period of time, has to do with trying to, in other words, if somebody rebelled against the Byzantine Empire, what they were trying to do is they were trying to conquer the trade routes of the Byzantine Empire. The legacy of the Byzantine Empire is that it was able to create and maintain ancient trade routes and supply routes. Um, and that is the product. Egypt, by the way, also was because of, and you should know this from history, because of its use of the Nile River, was also an incredibly productive region agriculturally. Um, you know, we often think of empires going out trying to find gold and silver. That is not what these empires were trying to do. They were simply trying to establish trade routes that made them incredibly wealthy in that sense. And the legacy of the Byzantine Empire is that many of the ports, many of the cities, many of the places that become major important points in history were established under the Byzantine Empire, or were at least enhanced by the Byzantine Empire. Not the least of which is the city of Constantinople. Constantinople, right there on the isthmus, right there in the Black and the Aegean Seas, right there in that point, is like the centerpiece of trade. It was, like I said, it was the crown jewel for centuries. It was the city to go to. And uh, we have evidence that people from as far away as Norway were going to Constantinople to trade. There's gold coins that signify this. We have archaeological evidence that people from ancient Russia and as far away as China were all coming to Constantinople to trade. And it makes perfect sense because they're coming up from, you can come from Russia, you can come down the Black Sea, you can skirt around the mountains that exist there, you can go along the Silk Road, you can go up the Tigris, you can go up the Euphrates, you can come up through Egypt and go through the Mediterranean and get to Constantinople, you can take the sea, you can take land. If you can survive all these barbarians in the West, Constantinople is the perfect place to go. And so the trade that it establishes exists. And Constantinople is an important city in terms of global trade all the way until the 20th century. And by the way, that's an interesting thing. We're really close to the 20th century. We're only 100 years removed from this. Constantinople has almost become an afterthought to us. But for centuries, it was the center. It was one of the centers of global trade. And it's a shame what eventually happens to it, and what is in some cases still happening to it. But nevertheless, at this particular period of time, it was one of the key aspects, and that trade, its legacy of trade, was significant for the modern world. The third thing is architecture. We don't often think of architecture associated with the Byzantine, but it's really architecture and art. There is no Renaissance in the West without the Byzantine Empire. Um, the Crusades, ironically, which we're going to talk about, were Western incursions into the old Byzantine Empire, specifically in an attempt to thwart the rise of Islam, and in a sense trying to protect the Byzantine Empire, but also reconquer Jerusalem. When Western thinkers began to have access and began to look at the Byzantine Empire, what they discovered was an enormous legacy of art and architecture. Byzantine mosaics, Byzantine churches were incredibly beautiful. They're incredibly well done. They were incredibly well designed. Um, the domes of Europe, there weren't really domes in Europe until they discovered the architecture and mathematical principles of the Byzantine Empire, which were, of course, the mathematical principles of ancient Greece, etc. Um, prior to the uh, prior to the Crusades, most churches in the West were built in vaults and simply squares, or basilicas, what became known as basilicas. Um, well, after discovery of the Byzantine Empire and what it had in terms of its architecture and art, Europeans began putting domes on their basilicas. Um, that's a mathematical principle. That's an architectural style. Um, one of the most beautiful churches, or what is now a mosque, is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. It's world renowned. It's one of the remarkable places to go and see. And just at every facet, almost every square, is perfect design. Um, just by the way it is built, it is beautiful. But then you begin to include the art that exists, the mosaics that exist, and to some degree paintings. Um, interestingly enough, the Greek Orthodox religion is heavy on icons. An icon is an image that you can use to inspire prayer. And to produce an icon, it has to be painted. And so artists engaged in much religious art. Um, and you can look these things up yourself. You kind of just look up Byzantine art, look up Byzantine mosaics, which are, on floors, Byzantine ceilings or architecture. All of these things have a huge legacy that eventually spread to Western Europe. And again, Islam did not wipe many of these out. They eventually took these principles themselves and made mosques the same way. Some of the beautiful mosques, including in Jerusalem, which was built on the old Temple Mount, connecting those great three religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all in one city, which unfortunately has led to a lot of bloodshed, but also it is one of the great, it's a testimony to this human history that has existed for thousands of years. And the Byzantine Empire maintained that for a long period of time and passed it on to its forebears or its predecessors, excuse me. All right, and then finally, in all of this, so if you're keeping track of the traditions, there's the legacy of the Byzantine Empire. It protects the Hellenistic culture or the Greek culture. It protects trade, and it produces art and architecture. And then finally, um, one of the great learning renaissances of world history happens in the Byzantine Empire. And what I mean by that is that the Byzantine culture of learning was robust. Almost every major city had a library, and those libraries were manuscripts. Now, when you think of library today, you think books, etc. Well, these were usually manuscripts. They were usually scrolls, and there were many of them. There were more than you would think. Manuscripts and scrolls were actually they existed in the thousands and hundreds in libraries. Um, but they were incredibly fragile and they're incredibly rare. And most scholars spent their lives just copying manuscripts. The idea of a scribe was somebody who was a professional copier. They just sat down and copied stuff. But that's how it was produced, and that's how it was sent to various locations. Monasteries were places of extreme learning, scientific experimentation. And by the way, you need to divorce yourself from the idea that most of our knowledge and understanding comes in the last 200 years of modern invention. Um, these, and even in Europe, even in quote unquote the Dark Ages, no, they had science. I mean, most people didn't believe the world was flat. It's a myth. Many of them understood, uh, even if they couldn't articulate it, they understood genetics to some degree. They understood agricultural principles of cultivation. Um, in some places they didn't. Eventually, why you have to learn the lesson in Eastern in the 1800s, it gets better, and they learn about these. There was better medicine in the Byzantine Empire, better understanding of health and wellness. Now, again, they can't perform surgery; they don't know what an anesthetic is, and so there's, it's very crude in that sense. But they did have a better understanding of anatomy. Um, Again, the West is way behind in many of these things. Um, but in the Byzantine Empire, there's a greater knowledge, again, stealing from the Greeks, especially of astronomy and the stars, and rotation of planets and their understanding of how things operate. Um, in the West, they were arguing heliocentrism versus geocentrism, and the other understanding of whether the sun is the center of the universe or not. Much of that was settled in Byzantine Empire. In the West, they're arguing it all the way until Copernicus. Um, don't get me wrong; some Byzantine scholars were way off on this, and some Greek scholars were way off on this as well. But they are studying, they are learning, and they're producing these thoughts. And that's just the sciences. In terms of philosophy and history, and what are known as the liberal arts, the study of these things, the study of ancient cultures and myths, etc. All of that is happening. The production of Bibles and biblical literature, stories are happening in this period of time. Eventually, Islam has its own development, and they start copying down stories. They are producing literature that exists with these things as well. Um, they're recording the court document. Much of what we know about the ancient world in terms of its history was written by these scholars. They put down stories, and they put down evidence as they collected it and put it into their own histories, etc. The works of Plato and Aristotle are being studied and kept alive in this particular period of time. So they're learning what could be argued are the first schools. Now, really not technically a university yet. That really happens in the West. But much of the idea of becoming a scholar or an academic person develops in the Byzantine Empire. All right, so there's your four legacies of the Roman Empire or of the Byzantine Empire, excuse me. Okay, so if this place is that important, and you maybe never heard much about this place before, or the Byzantine Empire before, then what happens? Well, a number of things. First of all, the decline is incredibly slow. It disintegrates piece by piece, beginning in the late 600s. And the number one reason is because of the emergence of Islam. Now, Islam keeps, and this is why you could make the case that the Byzantine Empire really never disappears; it just changes names. The Islamic, I'm going to give a whole lecture on Islam next. But suffice it to say, Muhammad appears in the 600s. He forms a new religion and then forms a new political entity out of that religion. His followers and eventually the people who lead Islam began conquering the region, and they they split the Byzantine Empire in half, and that their struggle and their continue to fight with the Byzantine Empire goes all the way through the Crusades and all the way into the 1300s and 1400s, and eventually Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire is overrun by what are called the Ottoman Turks, or the Ottoman, and those Ottoman Turks are a tribe within Islam, and they're different than the Seljuk Turks. Remember, there's all these different kinds of people groups. Well, one tribe in particular of Islam conquers the entire region, and a new empire is formed. But it's really the same empire that the Byzantine Empire was. It's just not Christian anymore. But much of its political existence is the same. It does many of the same things. It protects the old trade routes. It keeps the old Roman system in place. It it keeps the centers of learning. Um, the dominant cultural religion now becomes Islam over time, but for the most part, the biggest thing is that it stays the same geographically. Okay, but for Byzantine, just my point is that it disappears over time in a very slow period. The first great influence that changes it is Islam, not the least of which, even if it's just protecting itself from Islam, that has a major influence. And if you look at the third map, you'll notice that by 1300s, Byzantine had shrunk all the way into, in terms of an actual direct control of what was the old Roman emperor, or what the emperor had control over, goes all the way down. Now, here's the amazing thing is that the Byzantine Empire, Byzantine rulers never give up their claim to that region, nor do they give up their claim to Constantinople. They move though, under threat, under direct threat from outside influences, particularly Islam. They go into exile and they move to what eventually becomes Moscow, literally Russia. And so, in other words, the Tsar, called Caesar, the ruler of the Russian Empire, who has control over that region, claims, part of their great claims of the Russian Empire was that they were the descendants of the Romans, because the Byzantine emperors, who claimed to be descendants of the Romans, moved their government. And by the way, they moved their government to various places at first, and then eventually moved to um, Moscow or the Roman. And then, by the way, there's a split in the Eastern Orthodox religion. There's Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, because eventually rulers went back to Constantinople. The Islamic rulers allowed them to come back, and they said you have your seat of your religion here. It's long and complicated. But my point is that there's an argument that some people say it never ceased to exist in terms of its idea. But geographically, it becomes chaotic. It becomes crazy. I mean, and that's one of the key legacies of the Byzantine Empire, is that it's that geography. I would make the case that it exists. It just exists under Islam after the 1300s and 1400s, and it's just no longer called the Byzantine Empire. And Constantinople becomes the capital of the Islamic Empire, and it continues the legacy of Rome in that sense. And keep in mind, the Ottoman Empire, this Islamic empire that takes the place of the Byzantine Empire, doesn't disappear until 1918 at the end of World War One. That's eventually when it is destroyed. So again, centuries and centuries of this political region, an entity, this complex region, but in many cases the same culturally, with obviously a difference between Christianity and Islam. I'm going to talk more about that as we go forth from here. All right. So the biggest thing here is that change, is that influence on is that Islam and Islamic tribes began to tear apart the Byzantine Empire, eventually conquering it after centuries. Okay? There is one other great influence here that I want you to add to. I have the question on there. Um, the What were the influences? Also, Western Roman Catholicism has an influence here as well. Matter of fact, at one point in time, Roman Western Christians sacked Constantinople. It was part of their crusades. There's enormous wealth in Constantinople, and some of these Christian crusaders were out for loot and out for they really, I mean, this idea of conquering Islam and etc. was a nice idea, but in many cases they were out for adventure and out for loot. And when they got to Constantinople, they realized how rich it was and how substantial it was, and they simply raided and sacked the city. Um, and on top of that, the argument between the Pope and the Patriarch in Constantinople was robust, and Western Roman Catholicism began to insert its influence upon the Eastern Byzantine Empire, and it slowly crept in as well. Not the least of which is its military influence through the Crusades had a drastic impact upon the Byzantine Empire, and then trade also has an influence on the disintegration. I said it for a long time. Constantinople was the center of trade in the world. It was, right? But slowly but surely, as time moved on, the Western European powers begin to emerge, and a lot of trade slowly starts to move to the high seas. Um, and of course, this was Columbus. I mean, this is 1400. Byzantine Empire slowly starts to disintegrate as just prior to Columbus in the 1300s and 1400s, as Europe begins to expand very slowly. Um, a lot of trade starts to come off the high seas, and it's particularly in places like Spain, in places like Northern Europe, France, rivers of Europe start to take away some of that trade that was centralized in the Middle East, the Byzantine Empire. This is just a small influence, but significant over time, and also it helps us to make a major impact upon the Ottoman Empire or the Islamic empires that replaced the Byzantine Empire. So all of that's at play. And again, my point here today is to help you understand that the Byzantine Empire is significant. And it is really an area, if you're interested in studying something that most people don't know much about, is study the Byzantine Empire, study its influences, and study what came after, because it has a major influence upon world events in the modern world. And again, because we're so focused on what happened in Europe, that we forget how important these legacies and influences are. All right, so more to come. I'll connect all the dots here. I'm going to talk about Islam and its importance, and I've been referencing it, and we'll talk about the difference between Christianity and Islam because it is so incredibly significant. And in terms of the modern world and understanding why we have even to this day, why we have such a difference between East and West. All right, so I'm sending that to you fairly soon. I've been promising you all along that we would come fast and furious, and I haven't been able to fulfill that promise, but we have to get this done, and I will try to get it done and get you caught up as quickly as possible. Don't forget, fill out your sheet, answer the questions on there, and turn it into Moodle, and we'll keep that going as quickly as possible. Thank you very much.